That's not it. For joining this webinar, looking at measuring value, assessing the social value of development intervention. My name is Eunice Agbenyaji, and I'll be helping with moderation this afternoon. Value for money historically has been driven by the need to demonstrate impact of development work. Thus, development financing must show results. Indeed, for DFID, now FCDO, Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, in 2010, the focus on value for money was paraphrasing, maximizing the impact of each pound spent to improve poor people's lives. Many of us are conversant with the conceptualization of value for money around the 4 E's. 1, economy, which looks at getting the best value of inputs. 2nd E, efficiency, maximizing the output for levels of inputs. The 3rd is effectiveness, ensuring that outputs deliver desired outcome or outcomes. And the 4th, equity, ensuring that benefits are distributed. Whilst the value for money frameworks, as I have talked about, one of which is the 4 E's, it's good and does enable development actors to account for their work, there has been problem in terms of determining the returns on any kind of investment that is of social nature. So the problem with value for money has been the central focus on only money. And many of us do understand that it takes more than just money to impact lives of people, whether in the communities or around identities or around issues. And because value for money framing has been around money, and we have had the practice of development financing driven by, Northern-based organizations or funding, it has, to a very large extent, tilted power to those funding to determine what to measure in terms of development work. And in the context of shifting power, in the context of re-evaluating development practice to focusing on what is important to measure from the perspective of community members, we are organizing this webinar as practitioners to re-engage the conversation on value for money. What is important to measure? How do you measure social value in the interventions that we undertake? But even more importantly, how can we as civil society actors or facilitators mobilize and take on leadership in framing social value, in value for money, and also leading in terms of how we measure this, document this, and also disseminate. On that note, you are very welcome to the webinar this afternoon. We have people joining from all over the world, and we hope that we would have a very interesting conversation. It's now time to receive some remarks from my Executive Director, Alhaji Ibrahim Tanko, who would frame the purpose of today's conversation much more tangibly. Over, Tanko.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eunice. I think given the fact that we're starting a bit behind time, but also in terms of how comprehensive Eunice's introductory remarks have been, I wouldn't spend any more time. I'm sure the presenter would also detail for us, the understanding, the lessons, and also the recommendations for us as civil society practitioners, as donors, and as everybody who is interested in monitoring, evaluating development actions. So without much ado, I would welcome you all to this webinar. We look forward to very constructive conversations, and that out of the discussions, we'll be able to get pieces of experiences and lessons and recommendations that would inform policy and practice moving forward. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Eunice, please do the introductions.
All right. Thank you all. Could you please indicate in the chat box your name and your organization whilst we get the presentation up the screen? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for introducing yourselves. Before we take the presentation on the theme, what and how do we measure value of social change interventions? We would like to kindly ask you to participate in a quick poll, which is helping us to understand the people's perspectives or knowledge in value for money. So we have put in the chat box the link to the poll. Kindly spend some few minutes to take that poll, which would help us understand where people are at in terms of appreciation of value for money, or how they have used value for money in their social development intervention. Just for 2 minutes, please go to the chat box. The link is there. Great. Thank you very much. We can already see people accessing the link and filling out the poll. Great. So as you do that, it's my pleasure to invite to present the paper, Madam Adelaide Adu Fenim, who is a subscriber of Star Ghana Foundation, but also supports us in the capacity of a consultant on many things, including the development of this paper on value for money. Adelaide has been working within the development space for decades. She has held many positions, recent ones being the team leader for the STAC project funded by FCDO, then DFID. It's my pleasure to welcome you, Adelaide.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eunice, and hello, everyone, wherever you are joining from. It's a pleasure this afternoon, or whatever the time is, wherever you are, to have this conversation on value for money. And so I think Eunice did a great introduction, setting the scene for it. And I just want to say the thoughts that are being shared here may not necessarily be new. And so if you are someone who's an active person when it comes to value for money's practice and the evolving debates and methodologies and approaches, you may recognize some of the issues that will be raised here. However, I believe that today we're raising it in a very important context. And I think that's what kind of makes the conversation a new conversation. We are raising the conversation today rooted in the concept of how do we ensure that locally led development, which has been well recognized and well articulated and well committed to international development circles, how do we bring that to bear in practice in international development? And value for money is a key one to select, because when we're talking about the value of what we do in development, it's really at the crux, it's at the core of why the whole sector exists, what donors do, what we all do. And so we believe that it's an important topic to address whilst looking at how do we actualize locally led development. So I'll just go straight into the presentation. So first of all, I want to make the point that locally led development is a long commitment from the aid effectiveness agenda that began in Paris 2005 and came out with the aid effectiveness principles to Accra, the Accra Summit in 2008, to Busan in 2011, to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, Grand Bargain, which was recognizing that there needed to be a lot more shift to local players, local actors to lead, especially in humanitarian efforts. There's been Grand Bargain 1, there's been Grand Bargain 2, and in 2021, again, donors met and adopted the locally led adaptation principles, which was a commitment to say we recognize that good development is locally led development. And the most recent one is in December 2022, where again, at the Geneva Effective Development Cooperation Summit, donors again committed to promoting locally led development. In fact, in more specific terms, in that commitment in 2022, I picked out some of the statements that were in their commitment statement. And it says they were committing to shift and share power to ensure local actors have ownership. So it's a recognition that there's an imbalance. They're holding the power. And then they talked about rethinking our roles as donors, understanding and valuing local knowledge, capacity, and expertise, and also publicly advocating for locally led development. Now, there's a significance in it, because whenever we talk about value for money, immediately it puts the emphasis on the donor who brought the money. So when donors talk about valuing local knowledge, capacity, and expertise, it's already a broader recognition of a broader definition of what goes into development interventions. But I believe movements like Shift the Power are not new, but this time they are saying it's been a long while coming. The commitments have been made, the rhetoric has been, prolific, and yet we need concrete action. We are not there yet. We are not there yet. Although we recognize local development is good, we are not there yet. When we see the decolonization agenda, now we're talking about that. That means we know there's more sort of structural issues to break down in development. When we talk about Shift the Power that I just referred to, we recognize that there has to be a shift from commitment to concrete action. And how do you take concrete action? You take concrete action from practice. You take practice and you change practice. You make practice reflect the principles that you're talking about. And so this afternoon, morning, wherever you are, this conversation about value, it's also rooted in the recognition that whatever we are doing, whatever the practice is in development, bringing a perspective of localization to it is important for us to see it actualized. And so when we talk about measuring value, just for the sake of completeness, what are we talking about? It deserves importance, it's worth, it has worth, it is useful. In more development terms, sometimes we'll talk about results, we'll talk about the outcomes, we'll talk about the impact. When you talk about value for money, where it came from the private sector, they'll be talking about, monetary value, whatever was invested and what came out of it, it will be in monetary terms. But in the development sector, we also talk about social value because we recognize that there's benefits that comes from society through our investment. And so we're using, although these conversations about value for money, we're also using value for money as a microcosm of the power structure in the development sector, as we sort of understand it and look at the challenges in implementing it. It brings to bear the challenges that we have in the power dynamics, the power imbalance, and it once again echoes the importance of locally led development. Shift the power, let this work. Because why is that? When you look at value for money, there are different interpretations. If you go to the private sector where it comes from, they are saying when the returns on your investment outweigh the costs, then it's value for money. And we know that in development is not as straightforward. But what we agree is that value for money, it is at the heart of it is an evaluative question. How well have resources been used? Is the resource use justified? Have we generated value that we expected? And is that value, in some sense, is it commensurate to what has gone in? And not just money, is all the efforts, the social capital, the social networks, the indigenous knowledge, everything that goes in. Have we derived value that we're looking for? And we can't talk about value for money without touching the debates. Okay, now when value for money was introduced in 2010 by then UK Department for International Development, it was in response to pressure. There was pressure, UK public, UK Treasury was saying, demonstrate to us that, this money is delivering value. And so when it was introduced, what everybody knew or what everybody understood was this, private sector, principle of where you put in money and you want a return to come out. So of course there was a bit of consternation about it. There was questions about, is this appropriate to use in the international development sector, where you are not talking about straight investment of money, but you are talking about investment in human development, changing human lives. Is it even ethically right to apply this sort of monetary, judgment to it? There were also questions that coming straight off the aid effectiveness agenda, this was completely counter to the principles of interdependence, because in those agendas, donors and development practitioners were all discussing and agreeing on this sort of principles of co-working, co-dependence. So there was a lot of concern about it. There was also concerns about the costs. You know, whenever you start doing this analysis, the sense that this is complex and it will cost a lot of money. But I believe that, I think as you look at the literature, the arguments have evolved. And part of the initial concern was because of the way it was introduced. When it was introduced, it didn't come with clear guidelines. Indeed, DFID introduced it as an invitation to the organizations who were then holding their partnership agreements to say, oh, can you try this? How will you do this? And so, you know, there were all kinds of concerns. But I believe that, I think as you read the literature, you see that those conversations have moved on. There is an agreement that, you know, all stakeholders do want to know. We want to know what value is being generated from the work that we do. It's important for the public, it's important for skeptics, it's important for critics. And there are some actual examples that it actually helps to make better resource allocation decisions. It has helped also to identify models which can be used. And so the conversation has now gone to its questions about ownership. At the crux of concerns about value for money now is the question about ownership. Why are we doing it? For most, when you talk to civil society organizations, NGOs, both local and international, many would admit that you do it, you know, to meet a reporting requirement. And as Eunice mentioned, there's the 4 E's, so looking at economy, efficiency, effectiveness, equity. And many will tell you what is very clear in our minds when we're doing this is that the donor wants us to save money. So if we can prove that we've saved money, we've proven value for money. The bits around efficiency and effectiveness and how do you balance, you know, the best approach and the best price and how do you make sure that it's equitable, those have been harder for people to do. And so when we're talking about local ownership, we're saying the why has to shift. The why cannot be that it's because a donor wants it. If we all recognize that there's value in knowing whether our work is delivering, then it's not just about a donor, there should be a local ownership. A key question also comes up, whose value, whose perspective of value? So the donor's holding the money, and when you say value for money, then it almost immediately says, okay, value for the person who put the money in it. But we're recognizing that it takes a whole lot more than money. Many of us who work in this sector know it, that if we didn't leverage the indigenous knowledge and understanding and the capital that we carry, money usually doesn't go far. So whose perspective? And then even for us, you know, who manage, the work that we do, we are trying to impact the lives of communities, the lives of people at the lower level, you know, in terms of not far away from the national level. How do we get their perspectives? Have we ever wondered? Have we ever asked, you know, what do you think of value? How would they assess value? Because that then determines what gets assessed and what gets measured and how it is done and who does it. And I think one of the questions in the intro video was saying, there is a risk for all of us that if you realize that to be able to quantify and be able to show your donor that I've done so much of this, and that's what the donor sees as value for money, there is a risk that we start to play along and we start to commit to deliverables, which we know we can easily demonstrate value for, whereas we know that human development is complex. Many times we're not even sure what we are doing. We're just going to try. I remember, Tanko, you said there's a scattergun approach. We're trying a lot of things, and then through it we will learn. But if we're being assessed by, you know, very strict measures of what we quantify and what we monetize, then actually what's the incentive to do that? There's no incentive to try complex things. The incentive is let's do an easy one, we can count it, we can even exceed it very easily, we get an A+, we get a good performance score, and we're moving. So that makes it really a critical point for us to look at. And so, yes, hopefully this conversation provokes some rethinking, but please, we can move on. Please go on.
Yeah, perfect.
Great, good.
Exactly.
Yes, that's fine. Okay. So again, as I summarize, understanding the value of development interventions can never be wrong. Like we all want to know, but it's about these questions that we want to ask. And so there's a quote that I also, it summarizes the VFM, the challenge of VFM. And it's from a report that Oxford Policy Management did on assessing VFM. And it says that there's a lack of appropriate methods to support its assessment, that's VFM, and therefore a risk of reaching invalid conclusions. A VFM assessment is tied to a narrow set of indicators devoid of any evaluative judgment, for example, by emphasizing the most readily quantifiable measures rather than the most important but harder to quantify aspects. So when we talk about values, social values, things like social cohesion, a community that is better able to work together, where conflicts and divisions have been reduced through development intervention. How do we measure social cohesion? We talk about the need for resilient communities that whenever there are shocks, they don't suddenly, all the benefits don't just erode, but they are able to withstand shocks. How do you measure, resilience? When we talk about citizens who have been empowered and are more likely to engage with their local authorities, how do we measure that? We can count the number of events they have, but we know that that's not enough. We know there's something that has happened inside that community and those people, and yet it's VFM practice. It tells us that we are not doing very well when it comes to how we measure the intangible. Okay, now there have been examples. I'm sharing that because I think sometimes when an issue has gone on for a while, we can tend to think, oh, this is too difficult. It's too difficult to do. But actually, we can learn from some examples. So VFM, again, when we talk about VFM as a locally owned process, ActionAid used it as a reflection to reflect on their own work, and they did that with the communities. They had always done that at different levels, but they sat with the community and said, what do you think about what we're doing? Is it valuable to you? And so that is an important, reason to do it. It's a process for reflecting on the value of an organization's work. I believe that every organization should care about what its value proposition is. What do you say you bring to the table? If you were not there, what would be missing? And so I think that local ownership is key. It doesn't have to be argued. It's almost intuitive that every organization will want to know that. Again, ActionAid also placed communities at the center. So in this pilot, they started out by asking the communities for their definition of value. Like, what's important to you? What's valuable to you? What's useful to you? What's worthwhile to you? And the communities told them. And then they now matched that with the information that they have. So one other thing that came up from ActionAid's work is that they use simplified processes. So having the conversation with communities, they didn't go out with sort of complex matrix that will be over the head of communities or their own staff for that matter. But they were able to take the information that communities provided in its simple, qualitative, and powerful, impactful form. And then they engaged a consultant who was able to do a social return on investment analysis. And so I think sometimes people say, oh, these things are too complex. You can't take it down to the level of communities they won't understand. But actually, it doesn't have to be that complex. And actually, that's shown it. Again, it allows us to measure the value of community contributions. TEFund did that. They were able to calculate the social return on investment of a program. And they didn't only look at what they had contributed or what the donors had contributed, but they actually also looked at what the communities had contributed in terms of cash, in kind, their efforts, and they were able to actually show that it was quite an important contribution that the partners had made. So those are all reasons why we would want to measure value. So the premise for this, the premise for the conversation is actually, I will summarize it. Okay, that we realize that societal benefits from our work to promote whether it's active citizenship, this is in the case of Star Ghana Foundation or other organizations, we know that the project duration is not long enough. It's 2 to 4 years. Most of the time, the value we are talking about is actually manifesting afterwards. Earlier on, I was at a workshop where I met someone, one of the director generals of one of the Ghana government agencies that I'd worked with like maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And he's telling me about an impact that is now manifesting. Now that program ended like in 2020. But as I listened, what he was saying was so valuable. I was like, oh, wow, this is great. Now, where does that go to now? Like currently in our practice now, where does that go to? When we find out value that has been generated, it's even more impactful. Where does that go to? Because our practice now doesn't look back. You know, when the project closes, we do a value for money assessment at the point the project closes, and we are done and we are gone. So we're saying that the longer term value is often unaccounted for in our VFM assessments. It's not really there because we haven't looked at it. And that any effort to look at VFM, reimagining it again, we must look at especially the intangible aspects, because he was talking to me about how some inputs had brought a certain practice. Okay, now that we can't count it, but how are we going to do it? How are we going to be able to ensure that we can actually pick it up? And so here are some thoughts, some recommendations about how we might do that. And in the conversation, we can expand that further. But firstly, we're saying, you know, local actors need to lead efforts to define and test ways of measuring the non-monetary and intangible outcomes. And I'm saying local actors should take the lead, because we don't always have to wait for the donor to now say, oh, okay, now I want you to do this. But actually, if we're talking about local ownership and shifting the power, as much as we require the donors to shift the power, we must start shifting into the position of leadership. If you don't shift, actually sometimes, and so you shift it and the person sees that, hey, this chair is getting too small, they are not going to shift. But when you start shifting into the driving seat and you start demonstrating that actually, when we carry this agenda, we own this agenda, we can actually, you know, show you ways we can do this in more real ways. So I think that's the first thing, and requires a mind shift for us as local actors, especially from the global south. One of the things that comes out also in this work is that all the conversations, all the efforts, they are led from the global north. It's time for the global south to lead this. And so we're saying also placing the local stakeholders at the center of identifying propositions of social value. We must spend some time looking at it, because if we don't, we're just going to count. There's a risk that we count it. And then thirdly, investing in evaluating the longer term impacts of interventions through rigorous research. You see, where we don't know whether things work, evidence helps us. And we're losing a lot of evidence by not evaluating these things. And I believe that it's possible for donors to do. There are donors like FCDO have research, they fund research programs. So they should be able to connect research programs and interventions that they support to ensure that we are generating the evidence. In trying to do these recommendations, there are a number of things. So first of all, defining social value propositions from the work of an organization, program, or project. What are we about? Let's put it down. It can also, we can do that vertically and horizontally. Vertically, we can look at theories of change, you know, what sort of change can we expect to happen? We can look at that, vertically through the levels. So from an individual level, from community level, from group level, even from an international level, because what we're doing can actually impact as well. And then horizontally through our theory of change. How are we saying change happens? What might be some of the value that will come out at different stages? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is just sort of setting out how you might do that. You might do that looking at individuals, groups and communities, policies, institutions, national level and global practice. Okay, so they are just, rounding up. There are a number of challenges that come in, so how do you turn that which is intangible into a measurable measure? Because you still must measure it. And so, we propose that there's a criteria we can assess. So after we've done defining our social value propositions, we look at how will we measure it. And I'm suggesting the thoughts that, comes out is looking at what existing sources of indicators that can be used as proxies. How can we look at ways in which we can compare? What allows us to compare? How can it be verified? How can we predict? So these are just sort of things that we will do anyway, if we're trying to get smart objectives. But I think it's possible to subject intangible value propositions to that as well. But this effort needs partnerships and collaborations. So I talked about examples of what ActionAid had done, what Tear Fund had done, what Comic Relief has done. There are examples out there, but it takes a concerted effort. If one organization is doing it, it may not look as if it's working. But when we put a number of them together and we look at how we do it, then I believe that that can work. I think I've missed it. I missed one of my slides. But so this is again, after the first slide was talking about measurability, this is about identifying determinants, drivers, and conditions. Again, it's research. We want to understand what works. What does it work? After we have done a scattergun approach, how can we learn which ones work if we don't do research? And so, yes, I think that's fine. So again, it means that our understanding of what we are saying, our hypothesis of the change pathway, or what we think the change pathway is important for us to set out. And let's start looking at, how can we back this by evidence? Does the evidence exist already? I think we can link that better. If it's not there, how can we generate that evidence? And so I think it goes to a point about the case for evidence generation. Many will say evaluation costs money. When you invest, it costs too much money, we can use that money for implementation. But actually, for the benefit of beneficiaries, we want to know what works well, so that we don't spend money doing what doesn't work. So these are just pointers about. And then to end it all, it requires a collaborative and concerted effort. And I believe that the timing of this conversation is important. Shift the Power is having, in December, there's a whole summit looking at shifting the power. And I love what they say. They say it's moving to concrete action. And so the more we have concrete examples of practice where we say there must be change here, and we can gather momentum behind it, we can start to change practice one at a time. And as we do that, we shift the streaks. So thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to the discussion.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Adelaide. We will soon, I think not soon, we are going straight into the open forum. And we have many people that are also involved in the whole conversation on shifting the power. And one of the tenets of Shift the Power is building equitable relationships. So you can look at equitable relationship between the funder, and the funder can be an institution or an individual, and also the community. How do we place the entire conversation around shift the value for money in equitable relationship between funder, community, CSOs, communities, and I would like to invite Barry Smith, who is the co-director, Social Development Direct, because he will soon leave us to start the conversation by looking at where the connection between value for money and equitable partnership building.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Can you hear me, Eunice and
Yes.
colleagues?
Yes, we can hear you, Barry.
Thanks. I don't think I'm allowed to share a screen, so but I just have a few remarks, and thanks very much for that kind introduction and the great presentation that you've made, Adelaide. I just wanted to, as Eunice was saying, I go back with the foundation quite a long way, and was fortunate to be for 5 years on the consortium in Star Ghana Phase 2 and played a role as strategy and institutional development advisor. But in my current role in Social Development Direct, we're working as an organization very closely with what is now our parent organization, Plan International. And we have a common interest, which of course we also share with Star Ghana, around promoting a much more locally led approach to development, because we believe that, if you want, and the whole movement around shifting the power, or in some cases people talk about localization, is in fact a much more effective, efficient, ethical, and sustainable approach to development. And we're convinced, and we believe that evidence is emerging more solidly in recent years, that more equitable partnerships, are an important part of the equation in terms of international collaboration, resourcing, and sustained efforts around development, but also more equitable partnerships are absolutely necessary to achieve better results and more long-term impact. So if we look, that means that as Adelaide you've already eloquently pointed out, that value for money is a central issue to be developed and elaborated further in the framework of shifting the power, decolonizing development, whichever framework you want to put forward in this light. Unfortunately, in most donor-defined approaches to value for money, they're based on the DAC framework, which posits as a key point of reference the so-called 4 E's, and that's economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and importantly, equity. And clearly within that framework, there's a foothold for understanding value for money in a broader framework of locally led development and the value that adds. Because the criteria and area of measurement, which is called equity in that global framework, is certainly fundamentally about fairness in every way. It specifically is meant to draw out those elements of value for money that speak to addressing existing and historic disparities, both social and economic, essentially that address the global and national regional issues of inequality. And certainly from our perspective, from the perspective of Star Ghana Foundation and many of our sister organizations, that's fundamentally about reaching the most excluded people, communities in development, in particular initiatives, including those most affected by poverty and different other forms of social marginalization. The equity pillar of value for money is about achieving and measuring how programs and initiatives are enabling a fairer distribution of benefit from development investments and processes, And it's also based on the presumption and the necessity that in order to be able to measure equity, we need to be disaggregating how benefits are distributed to what different people, stakeholders, and partners for that matter. So there is a strong, if you want, foothold or foundation for building on the broad international VFM framework. But we also have the opportunity now, I think, to push the boundaries of what equity means, because it's arguable that current definitions are perhaps slightly narrow and out of date. And for us to demonstrate, there's an opportunity for us to demonstrate how more locally led development and more equitable partnerships actually enhance efficiency, how they improve effectiveness, and indeed, in some cases, in fact, drive economies and efficiency, cost savings in programs. Not in every respect, but certainly in some. So Plan International and ST Direct have been engaged over the past couple of years in one part of the international effort to define what localization or locally led development, and particularly the aspect about building equitable partnerships might look like. And we started very much with the evidence base that's available to us. On the one hand, from the international literature on these issues and on partnerships, but also on the very practical evidence and experience of development practitioners and partners in the Plan ST Direct family. And that's a very large family if you consider Plan International as a federated international development coalition with a very large footprint around the world, and which has a strong commitment now to forwarding the Global Pledge for Change, for example, which includes commitments around increased localization and locally led development and equitable partnerships. But the challenge I think we've been responding to in this research and methodology work that we've been doing and research has been about how do you move from strong values in this direction and admirable goals to actually implementation and practical tools to achieve equitable partnerships and broader locally led development partnerships. So we have conducted quite a bit of research, including with practitioners around the Plan family in all kinds of different countries. And that research provided additional evidence to that actually reinforces other global evidence that that on the one hand there is a real appetite for movement in this direction, but also a whole series of challenges and opportunities that need more close investigation. One of the aspects of that area is really how do we understand better what the cost drivers and implications of more equitable partnerships, what does that look like? And it does sometimes tend to be the case that that aspect.
Hi, Barry.
Yes.
Sorry to butt in. Could you please begin to wrap up in like 3 minutes? Thank you.
Absolutely. Sorry, I'll try to be brief then. So this financial side of things, including value for money, has been neglected. So we have produced some tools, including a continuum tool that stresses the importance of setting a level of ambition for how you want to move towards more equitable partnerships in specific situations. And we've been investigating what the cost might look like, that cost centers might look like, that then I think can be explored in terms of defining a wider approach to value for money. So just briefly, I think that I'll close on suggesting to the group that as we think of applying value for money in a way that does improve locally led development and prospects for equitable partnerships, we need to consider exactly what levels of time, staff leadership, devoted partnership capacity, and other drivers of the time investment that will yield better results overall. We need to understand what the investment would be in both convening and dialogue within the partnership and with stakeholders. Costs tend to increase the more ambitious we are in terms of equitable partnerships. And so, for example, that may include the costs for capacity development, both, not just one way, but both ways in terms of joint learning, development of partnership skills, ways of working, brokering skills, negotiation skills, and the leadership capacities that are necessary. There may be additional costs in travel and meetings in different cases. Sometimes those things may be in person, sometimes travel may not be necessary, but it requires time for meetings. And finally, there are investments that are required in organizational preparation, transition, forming common purpose and common vision around localization and equitable partnership. And it also may entail some transition costs from traditional ways of doing development in the old donor-recipient model towards something that is more truly equitable, and that may include the need for more unrestricted funding for organizations like Star Ghana Foundation and others to actually play that leadership role. So to turn that on its head, we need to be able to not only understand those costs, but then be able to translate how those costs will result in better value for money. So thanks very much for your time, and I'm sorry if I've pushed the limit on the time available. Thanks.
The end, but those are very great thoughts you have shared with us, looking at both the opportunities and the challenges that there are in moving towards equitable partnerships. We also would like to invite Barbara Nost, who works with the Zambia Governance Foundation, and it's also an anchor partner for the Comic Relief FCDO Shift the Power program in the Zambia. Barbara, you have been part of the Shift the Power conversation right when it started in 2016. And you have been part of the voices that have been asking for more flexibility, more opportunities for local organizations to determine their priorities in their negotiations with funders of all sorts for development work. Could you share with us your reflections on particularly what roles Southern-based organizations can play in the direction of VFM? I mean, should we take off the M? If we take off the M, what should be there? What role do you see for Global South organizations in shaping the conversations, but also shifting funders towards a more nuanced and a more nuanced application and practice of value in social development work?
Thank you, Eunice. I will be very brief, and I will talk from the perspective of a practitioner as a manager of a local organization here in Zambia, Lusaka. I think since we have become part of the Shift the Power movement back in 2016, following our participation in the global summit of community foundations in Joburg in 2016, that kind of sparked this, created this spark for all this interest in the community philanthropy and the Shift the Power movement. I have seen some notable changes, and I think I would not like to discard them because even though we might tend to be negative, the things never change sufficiently, but I have seen some positive changes in the people we work with and also with peers and other organizations. But I think for us in the Global South to be able to drive change in the international development practice, I think first and foremost, we need to build a critical mass of local organizations that actually recognize that value for money should not be the main criteria for measuring success. They should be the ones who push back and promote other alternative concepts. The ones my two colleagues have mentioned, particularly the lady, the researcher who did this very beautiful and interesting presentation earlier on. I think, and what we should do from a practical point of view is first of all recognize ourselves the importance of social capital we have in the Global South. And I think this is often ignored or discarded. It is never an issue. It's never a discussion, or maybe a very small discussion with funders. To what extent do you have influence, and what is your social capital? And I think why is it important? Because it talks about the power of networks and the power we have within the network and through the network, the social trust we build, the working together as people, the ability to drive a change as a collective, and the ability of people to jointly imagine the highest potential they as a community would want to achieve. And it also it is also necessary for us to recognize the contributions of communities and local organizations, be it in form of local giving, financial or in-kind contributions, or the skills people offer in support of community building, social cohesion, any kind of mutual benefit arrangements, any kind of voluntary social caregiving or volunteering that usually is never accounted for, it's falling through the cracks. And there's very few studies that actually take account of this kind of activities as a result of social capital. Then it also means us as local organization working with recognizing the importance of the moral capital we have, which local organizations or community leaders express through their work to create, for example, more equal communities or equal societies, through us promoting solidarity, bottom-up or participatory decision-making, respect for community needs, or the desire to uphold and practice values, which we would like to see replicated in the communities we serve. But it also needs us recognizing the importance of our intellectual capital. We have the ability to collect and analyze data because we work with the communities and in the communities. And this data can help us assist communities and local citizens to make much better decisions. This includes rigid data collection, analysis of the data, and this will help to improve our interventions and our support interventions, and this will help us learn from the past and interpret the future. At the community level, it is also important to recognize the local knowledge systems. Then the second last is the importance of our reputational capital, the positive perception we have created, or the trust we enjoy in the communities or with the CSOs we work with. And it helps us to build partnerships and with organizations or communities. Now, the second last before financial capital, which I don't need to talk about because there's a lot of talk about financial capital, we take it as a given, is the importance of the social aspects of our interventions. Why we need to talk about well-being, the happiness, the human security of individuals and communities, and as measured in their own words, as described or measured by them, which can be very different from the definition of well-being or human security used by funders. So I leave out the financial capital, and I think if we use this social, reputational, moral, intellectual capital, if it uses as a toolbox, we can create a collective power that can help shape the conversation about measuring success and shift the conversation from where it currently is, very much centered on value for money, away from value for money to a place where people feel their needs are truly taken care of. For example, dignity, respect, happiness, and so on and so forth. I think we need to much more use our moral intellectual capital, which is embedded in global solidarity and equal partnership, to support this shift of powers. And most importantly, I think the social capital we have we have created through the Shift the Power movement. And if any of you is registered on the MyPando tool, where you can actually see, if you register the organization and you create the linkages to the organizations globally that you have been in touch with, work with, have been in a discussion with, or collaborate with, it clearly sees that the movement has grown very, very big. And I think ourselves, we need to make use of this social capital much more as a large global collective of local organization, grassroots organization, progressive funders, activists, and so like. And I think the Global Summit, the Global Shift the Power Summit, is an excellent opportunity to take this conversation to the next level. Thank you very much. This is my short intervention.
Leadership for disability organizations and individuals, and you have had the opportunity to work with, many funders, both international funders and local funders. Share with us your experiences with, reporting on value for money to these partners that have supported your work. But also, very importantly, could you speak to suggestions about the value of the work that your organization does, and how that must be assessed? What value must be assessed for an organization like you? Like yours, sorry, that's bad English, like yours.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so privileged to be here. My name is Francis Asson, as was introduced already. I work with Africa Disability Institute, formerly Voice Ghana. We were a grantee of Star Ghana program before, also for Star Ghana Foundation. I also serve as a subscriber of the foundation, and I'm one of the outgoing governing council member of the foundation. So yes, thank you, Adelaide, for the comprehensive and then very deep presentation about value for money, and quite a number of things that you touch on. In fact, speaks to some of the things I've been thinking over the years about this whole conversation about value for money, where the weight is more on the economic value when assessing value for money on the CSO's projects, both short or long-term projects. There's always this conversation around the money, and as we all know, and it has also been echoed from previous presenters, that you can because it is donor driven, the money is given or the grant is given by donor. It is more like, okay, show us how you manage this money for us, and in that case, it makes ownership not to be seen so much by the implementing agencies or organizations as to how they can own this whole conversation about value for money in their work. And yes, so always the focus is on the economic value, and then an element of efficiency, the effectiveness and equity seems not to be broadened so much. And as the previous presenters and also Adelaide, the researcher also point out, social value is really giving any thought or consideration when we are really thinking or talking about value for money. So with this, we tend to measure, when we talk about social value or the equity aspect or element of value for money, then it is more like, okay, how many people have you reached within your project? And then how equitable was the equitable was the outcome of your project, your projects to your beneficiaries and all that. And that tends to only limit the social value, which to me, I think social value of value for money can best be assessed at impact level and over time, say 5 to 10 years after completion of a project, to determine if there is any value in investing in such projects. I stand with this because whatever project, could it be a year or two projects that we implemented with donors of late, we've also started Ghana program, then to the foundation, to CEWA, to Ford Foundation and all that. The focus has always been on, okay, how have you fared within the project time frame? And after that, nobody cares again as to if the impact has started, I mean, the project has started making some significant impact after 4 or 5 years of the project. That is nobody's baby in a way. So for me, I see that the social value for that matter to be something that should be measured at a longer time, not immediately during the project implementation. And I can give my example, my organization as an example. Look, we benefited from some capacity building initiatives from IBIS West Africa, now Oxfam, in 2005 to 2010. We also benefited from VSO, that Voluntary Service Overseas Program in Ghana, 2005 to 2010. And Star Ghana, Star One, as I said, sustainability step change 2013 to 2020 projects and other donor projects. The value for money assessment at the time was more initiative. We can say it was so much on how much the money, the grant was assessed at that time. So there wasn't so much initiative. This capacity can translate into at the end of, let's say, 4 or 5 years. So over time, the impact of of all this intervention now I can best describe it that after all these years, 2005 to date, we can now start to see the impact, the real impact of the galvanization that is being felt by with our operation and expansion, as well as the how people with disabilities are being impacted with our work. But during that time, when we were implementing the project, if you want to apply a value for money principle, the 4 E's, we may jump the gun. We may not look so much into what we can be able to more like be transformed into at the end of some years after the implementation of the project. So I agree with earlier presenters, earlier presenters that yes, the focus shouldn't be so much on the immediate sort of assessment of value for money. Let's now start to look at the social value. And as I always say, for lack of a better word, that's the impact value of value for money. So that the weight shouldn't so much be, okay, we give you $100,000, and then how much have you used it? How judiciously have you spent that money and all that? And then we try to report on that. And even the reporting, with my experience, let's say we are implementing a project, and every quarter you report to donor. So every quarter, value for money, efficiency, effectiveness, how have you been effective in spending money? How have you been effective in all these 4 E's? You report on it every now and then. So sometimes you even don't know what to report on again. So because every quarter you seems to be repeating yourself in that manner. So I'm not condemning, but what I was trying to say is if with a conversation can rather be on value for investment of donors' money in the work we do, not so much value for investment in our work. At the end of the day, 4 or 5 years, let's look at it, let's look back to it and see how it is impacting life, how it is making progress. I think that will help us so much. Because this conversation about social value, I think Star Ghana and Star One, there was some initiative of that nature. And I think now that other organizations, as the presenter mentioned earlier, the researcher mentioned, that they have also been some research here and there. Then my question now is, after this hotness, how do we move forward with this whole conversation so that we try to situate social value into this whole assessment of value for money, so that we will not be seen as maybe for the short-term project, measuring it using the 4 E's, and then thinking a lot has not been done. But after years, over time, we can see so much from that project. So how do we move forward? Maybe that is what I'm leaving behind now for the researcher. What have you heard from others as you conduct this research? What is the way forward after this hotness? How do we communicate this to both donors, to CSOs, to government, to everybody, so that social value can really be situated on the within the radar of value for money assessment? Thank you.
Francis has talked about. And then the first one is about assessing social value from a long-term perspective. And that is important. The second also is that even if you are measuring value for short-term intervention, there must be recognition that that is not all the value being measured. And those are very important comments you have made. And I think for donors, both local and international, what you're saying is that we must also be mindful of when to ask for an assessment of value. Should it be quarterly? Should it be 6 monthly or yearly? So thank you so much for sharing those perspectives. Soon we will take any question, observation. Please just use the reaction, raise your hand if you want to talk. If you don't want to talk but you have a question, please put it in the chat box, and we will soon take them. But our last input would be from Sadat from Oxfam So there are a lot of conversations happening around localization and locally led development. Now, localization conversation is targeted at INGOs to cede more power to their local offices. So, for example, Oxfam International ceding more power to Oxfam Ghana to determine their strategy for Ghana. And that's the conversation on locally led development. Now, locally led development has meaning for every development actor. It is about how communities' priorities determine your interventions, rather than your interventions determining what communities should do. So the conversation on localization, locally led development, those seem quite, similar and very different. That the localization targeting INGOs, locally led development, relevant for every actor in development. So I'd like to ask Sadat to reflect on how Oxfam's whole, transition towards, promoting localization within the Oxfam Confederation or network, how that is shaping considerations such as what to measure and how to measure. Is Sadat with us? All right, okay. So we have some hands up. Can we go quickly? Yes, so we will take the first round of observations or engagement on the presentation. So we have David, we have Barry. Can I see what else? Okay, so we have David, we have Barry, we have Christopher. So let's take David, and I will come to Christopher and end with Barry for the first round.
Okay, thank you very much, Eunice, for the opportunity. My name is David Kewisi. I'm the Director for Youth Rise International based in the Central Region. As a youth-led grassroots organization, we are happy that this conversation is going on. It's always been our passion to see local philanthropy and community leading their own development, because we see in that as a sustainable tool towards achieving sustainable development. Now, in terms of the first presentation, very beautiful, comprehensive, but some key thing that we wanted to share is that what value, who determine value? Value should be conceptualized to represent the social change and the transformation that we want to achieve in the lives of individuals, families, and communities. Because in our perspective, the essence of social investment through a donor funding or community development work is seeing that transformation, seeing a change in the lives of the individual, the family, the communities. So that should be the value that we should focus on measuring. Now, how do we measure value? I think that value can be measured from the perspectives of the community and also from the civil society. And one of the ways to do that is that we should work towards highlighting impact assessment and evaluation in projects, such a way that in every donor support, there should be allocation towards baseline survey and endline evaluation. So that's one of the ways that we could measure change or value. So at the beginning of the project, there's an allocation in the budget to conduct a baseline survey to get together the state of the community before the intervention was administered. At the end of the project, we do endline survey or endline impact assessment to be able to measure the change, which represents the value that we seek to achieve. So in our perspective at Youth Rise International, this is what we think we can define value for and how we think value could be measured. Thank you.
Good, I'll go to Christopher. All right, okay, so let's take Barry.
Yeah.
We'll come to Lucy.
Hello.
All right, go, Christopher.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. I think it's a very useful and timely discussion as we are looking at value for money and the dispensation on the shifting the power concept. This story started some years back, but we drop it as Ghanaians community in terms of volunteerism, where people at our background were trying to support themselves. But we have not been able to really translate the effort of the people in monetary terms. If we were to do that, it will have really motivated them for them to see that they are also contributing to the value that we are talking about. It's not everything that we may see as physical money, but the contribution of the people to a particular community work can really motivate them to do more. And then when they equate it to whatever a donor is giving to them, they will also see that they have also given value to whatever the donor has provided to them. So to me, I expect that we go beyond our discussion sometimes and then go deep into the community and make it more practical with them so that the sustainability aspect will be maintained. Over.
Great, thank you. We will take Barry, your hand is up, and we'll come to Lucy.
Thanks very much, Eunice. And thanks for the invitation to join today. I'm sorry I had another commitment, so I couldn't join the earlier part of Adelaide's presentation. So some of what I may say may be covered, but just wanted to thank the other presenters as well. I think that Barbara, you've made some really critical points in terms of exploring what kinds of value that aren't sufficiently captured in the existing kind of bureaucratic framework for value for money. Definitely and Francis, you mentioned the importance of really amplifying our understanding of social value. All of those things, social cohesion, building social capital, intellectual capital, indeed moral capital, capitalizing on local knowledge, and maximizing well-being. All of these are distinct and real value that organizations bring. I think we could all admit that we are probably, on the one hand, not encouraged enough by the existing value for money frameworks that donors and institutions use to draw that out. And on the other hand, we all probably need to be better at measuring and documenting all of that real value. So I think there's sort of I just wanted to leave, I've got to leave. I think there are sort of short-term opportunities within the existing framework of value for money by amplifying social value and all those other forms of social return in relation particularly to the equity pillar of existing value for money, but also on effectiveness and to some extent efficiency and maybe less cost. But I think, so in the short term, I think we want to push the envelope on that existing framework, in my view, since we don't have the option, if we're in the aid system working with those partners, to just dispense of it. But I do appreciate that there's a much more ambitious medium or long-term goal to actually transform the value for money concept to something wider and much more inclusive. And indeed, we may not be talking about it as narrowly defined value for money as we do now. But I think the challenge for us all is to use these opportunities and this debate and discussion to understand how we can better measure and document our social value and impact. And I think, as Francis, you were saying, that long-term value is often not easy to be measured in the short-term framework of value for money. But if we can understand how we with partners are achieving system shifts in the direction of that much bigger, longer-term impact, then that, I think, is something that, so I would encourage us to think about that kind of systems perspective in articulating value for money. And finally, I think some of the strongest evidence of all has to be, as one of our most recent speakers said, about really using the framework of value money to collect feedback from communities themselves, from people in communities who are should be the center of everything we do, so that they are communicating directly the value to them, their communities, their well-being, because that evidence, I believe, is compelling in terms of addressing this imbalance that exists within the current practice, which tends to privilege cost effectiveness over social impact, equity, and indeed broader social justice. So thanks for the opportunity to join you today briefly. And thanks to the other speakers for your contribution.
Great. Thank you very much, Barry. Lucy, your hand is up. Please take a go at it.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, the point I'm about to raise has somewhat been touched upon by Barry, and it relates to the fact that at the moment we have this very dominant framework, the 4 E's, and obviously we've analyzed its weaknesses or challenges, if you like, limitations, if you like. But in moving forward in this discussion, what for me I think would be helpful, it doesn't have to be one for today, but just something to reflect upon, is whether what we are talking about is reforming that framework. So, so developing further that, especially that equity element of it, and ensuring that some of the things that we care about, that we think are important, are relating to equity, social transformation, and so on, are included, or whether we are saying this is a framework that maybe has outlived its usefulness, is not particularly useful, and we are looking to transform and develop something completely unique to, maybe to shifting the power, or anyway, certainly I think the point I'm trying to make is that, is this about reform or is this about transformation?
Yeah, yeah. That's a very critical question. Input. We will hold on to it and take Anita and Goldman, and then we will reflect on the issues that have come up. So Anita. Hello, Anita.
She's not ready to go to the next.
Okay, so we'll take Kofi Essien.
Yeah, hello, thank you very much. I think I will, my name is Kofi Essien, Dr. Essien. I'm with the Hunger Project Ghana. Yes, I will re-echo what Francis said when it comes to how the value for money is being measured, because the community where we work, they themselves also have social audit that they do for whatever is being done in their communities. And sometimes a donor may give a funding to do something that may sound so good somewhere, but if the communities decide that where it is not even beneficial to them. It defeats the value for money issue. So it's when you talk about the value for money, it's a very complex thing that it shouldn't be looked at one-sided. It should be a broad thing that should be looked at on so many aspects of it, in that it will look the way it's supposed to. Other than that, if you look at a financial aspect alone, you will miss it. So that's my contribution to the discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Anita, are you ready? Okay. So a lot of, a lot of the observations are more of, comments rather than questions, which we like very much, because then they are expressing people's, perspectives on the issue. But I thought that we can engage on those that are questioned. So, and of course, those other observations, we may want to touch a bit on them. So the one key one is looking at the existing framework for value for money, mainly around the 4 E's. Should we be looking at reviewing those frameworks and what goes into measuring along the economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and equity? Or we want to transform how value for money is done by asking for a more nuanced or a more responsive tool or measurement as the context requires. And I'd like to have some perspectives on that, maybe first from Adelaide, and then Tanko can also share some perspectives on that. Are we going for a reform of the existing framework on value for money, or we are asking for a transformation?
Right, okay. I mean, that's a very sort of valid question. Now, I'll answer this in this way. Looking at the literature, you find that actually a lot of work has been done to build on what was initially introduced. Like we know that initially we didn't even have equity there, and later was added. There's actually a lot of work that has been done to try and explain the principles, underpinning economy, effectiveness, efficiency. So actually, when you go and read all of those, you realize that it has been actually presented very well. It's been explained. When you read those guidance, you realize that, oh, it's quite relevant. It has touched on, some of these matters we are discussing. But the fact that it can't still shift practice tells us that there is something there. So it's perhaps not about just continuing to define and explain and, turn around the same old framework, which people are finding problematic, but is there some way to perhaps begin from a different point? So let me give an example. What ActionAid did was to say, let's not start with the framework. Let's not go and start saying we are trying to do economy, but let's start having the conversation about value first. And so it may be that even with your communities, you are not even going to talk about efficiency. You're not going to even have that conversation. You are having a conversation about what change is this bringing. But I think there will always be the need for a framework for analysis. And so I think it's whether, we think that this is fit for purpose. I think Barry said something really important, that there is something about the short term and the long term. Okay, so there may be some short-term ambition about what do you actually do now? This is what's happening. This is the dominant framework. You've probably got grants where you have to report on this. So is there a way to hang something more on equity, not just being, did you reach, people equitably, but are the processes equitable? Is there fairness? even in how we're doing this. Have we covered everything? So a broader definition of equity, I think, I thought that was a really great suggestion he made. But I think the literature shows us that there's been a lot of building on, reforming, tweaking, and all of that, and we're still here. So I think there's something that says that maybe further tweaking it may not necessarily answer it, but maybe there is some opportunity in picking some components. So that's what I would say.
All right, okay. Tampa, would you want to provide any perspectives on whether we're going for reforms or we are aiming for transformation?
Thank you very much. And I think I associate myself largely with what Adelaide has said. And so Barry, in the sense that within the framework of our existing projects and grants commitments, we may not be looking at transformation, radical transformation. But I think in the long term, the medium to long term, but starting from now, we need to begin to have conversations as to how do we engage with our partners? How do we become part of the global discourse and conversations around, the kind of language, the discourse, the frameworks that inform and shape development practice? We've been talking about decolonizing developments. We've been talking about shift the power. We've been talking about localization. At the heart of all this, are the voices and agency of communities and local organizations. So how do we work towards that? And I think that first is that let's develop spaces even within Ghana here that enables us to continue with these conversations, to begin to engage locally with development partners in Ghana here around how do we change this? How do we put communities at the center? And we can use the fact that these donors or development partners have signed up to all the frameworks and guidelines and etc. that emphasize shifting the power and putting communities at the center. And then secondly, it's that first as a collective of Ghanaian organizations, but also as our individual organizations to link up to the global conversations, that would help to influence, how the development paradigms and the kinds of frameworks and etc. that we are being asked to implement. And so when Francis talked about Star Ghana asking them for quarterly reports on value for money, I can understand, where he's coming from. But I'm glad to report that as the Star Ghana Foundation, we've stopped asking for quarterly. But I think we can also start to begin to change the nature of our relationship with our partners as a way of modeling what we believe in. And I don't know, perhaps at the end of this, we may want, at the end of this conversation, to look at, is it possible for us to even set up a technical committee that would begin to look at the kind of indicators we want to see, indicators that speak to the aspirations that we've discussed today, and to use that then to begin to engage with our partners, starting from the INGOs all the way up to the development partners. So for now, those are the points I would like to make. Thank you.
All right, okay. Thank you very much. I think there are some questions in the chat box. We have about 11 more minutes to the top of the hour. And so let's see what questions have come through in the chat box. So can we go up? Yeah. So there's a question on whose duty is it to set such social value standards in their culture of work, the donor or the implementing agency? Yeah, I think that's a very real question. And I was also reflecting on where do we start from in terms of shifting the system to respond and kind of prioritize social value. And I think that on one hand, if we are thinking about affecting the system, then that's a body of work to be done with funders, you know. And when I use the term funders, I'm looking at both institutional and individuals, because you can have, you know, very large individual donations to civil society. That in that kind of conversation, where do we place emphasis? So we need to work with funders to co-create indicators for measuring value. And that can only happen if there is a flexibility where you as an organization are invited to the table. So we cannot even start the conversation on what is important to measure if we not deal with the issue of, you know, participatory decision-making, equitable partnership, because if you are not at the table where those frameworks, decisions are created, then your input would not be taken on board. So I think that's the first step, and this is where the work of the movement is important, because then the movement has access to bigger platforms where both bilateral, multilateral foundations can be engaged on, you know, frameworks for development support and etc. And for those of us going into the Bogota conversation and afterwards, this is something that we need to bring back again to the table on measuring what is important, you know, measuring what matters to communities. That's one. But I think there's also some work to do with, you know, us wherever we are, because as Adelaide said, it's about practice. So even in your own way of working with communities, and so we are tempted to think that we only begin to engage with the communities when it's about time to evaluate. But I think it is at the start of an intervention, all right? So, and many of us talk about, you know, where we do the scoping to determine what is important. I think that is where we begin this whole conversation about what is important to the communities and what would they want to measure? So that becomes even the basis for our own, you know, design of the result matrix. So because then they have already envisaged for us what is important to them that will go into the result framework, so that when it becomes, it's time for measuring, then we are actually measuring what the communities have, you know, indicated. And the how of the measuring is also important. And I think Adelaide talked about it in her presentation. So it is one thing to identify what to measure, and the other is how to measure, because if it is you, the implementing organization, civil society, or the donor measuring without the perspectives of the communities, then it can the measurement can fall short of communities' own understanding, perception of what has changed and why it has changed. So that is also important. So I think that to answer the question, there is relevance for the work that is done with donors at the global level. That's also relevant for the work that we do, because consider yourself also as a donor, right? Because you are in the community with resources, working with communities. So at all of these levels, there's some work to do. And then the question about, so what do you use to influence? And that's what Tanko was talking about earlier, that maybe perhaps there isn't much framing of indicators around social value. And so maybe that is where we need to, as people on this call, begin to look at, and a lot of input has come across or come up for us in terms of how do we measure social value. And so just to reiterate Tanko's point about invitation to people on this call to work with us, and that also responds to Francis' point about, so what do we do so it doesn't end up as a conversation? Invitation to join us to work on social value indicators that we can take to any conversation that is targeted at influencing donors, but also influencing our peer organizations.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That is all right.
All right, yeah.
Sadat.
Yes, great. So we have Sadat. Apologies, Sadat, that you were speaking and we couldn't hear you. So Sadat works with Oxfam. He's currently the acting country director for Oxfam in Ghana. And we wanted Sadat to share with us your reflections on Oxfam's transition, or Oxfam's work on localization and how that is enabling or hindering Oxfam to working with communities to measure what is important for them to them. So Sadat, the floor is now yours. If you can just start in 3 minutes.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, sorry. Initially, I was talking to myself. I didn't know you guys were not hearing me. But I largely agree with what the previous presenters and interventions were made in terms of the presentation. So, like Tanko said, globally, we have signed up to many of those commitments. So, the Pledge for Change, we have signed up to that. And so, within that space, Oxfam is essentially looking at different ways of living by those pledges that have been made globally. So, concrete actions. One of those actions has been to design what is known as the Decolonized Partnership Strategy, which is essentially looking at how do we have a partnership strategy, how we engage within Oxfam and with national organizations we work with in a way that is decolonial, that is feminist, and of course, that is also gender just. So that is what is happening currently in Oxfam. There's also another approach that Oxfam is using, which is known as the racial justice framework. We also recognize that when we talk about shifting power and decolonization, it's also a racialized thing. And so how do we talk about the question of racial equity in an organization such as Oxfam, which is also facing similar challenges? So in the context of Ghana, we are also trying our best to see how we can live by those commitments. And so we are starting to talk about reviewing our own partnership strategy, how we partner in Ghana. And we've been engaging in that conversation. We've also been part of the national level conversation about reimagining the INGOs, so the Ringo conversation. So we are also part of that in Ghana. So those are the few things that we're doing in that space. But I may want to use the last minute of my conversation to just also highlight some practical things that I think that this movement or platform should consider going forward. One of the things normally I reflect on, I call it the RRI, role, relevance, and impact. Role, relevance, and impact. And these are very important when we talk about shifting power in whatever we do. How do we reimagine or rethink our role as an INGO in Ghana within the broader conversation about the shift the power conversation? What is our relevance in Ghana within the context of the discussions about shifting the power, localization of aid, and others? And last but not the least, what is our impact? How are we impacting the conversation? How are we impacting based on our practice, procedures, and systems that we have in place? And how are we impacting also on the communities where we are working and making sure that we are not just reproducing the colonial legacies of development, which I believe are not correct, most often are unethical, disrespectful, and also sometimes causing harm than doing good. In terms of whether we want to reform or transform, I believe that the best way is to transform, but like Tanko and other previous speakers said, we will have to start from where we are. And I think starting from where we are, we have opportunities in country, but of course, you are dealing with donors. Eunice, you mentioned donors quite a lot. That donors now have something they call innovation. perhaps that's an area we need to tap into. So when we are dealing with donors and we are writing proposals, we say, we want to innovate on how do we bring about the social value into the conversations of value for money. That could be another way that I think in terms of the few steps that we could take. And perhaps once we begin to have those innovative ideas coming up and we are reporting that back to donors, we will eventually succeed in influencing them to start to walk the talk in terms of actually accepting that value for money is good, but there's also a social value to how we do that, that as well. The last but not the least practical one I wanted to suggest is that perhaps we have to start also to look at how we do baselining, midterm reviews, evaluations, and end-line evaluations. Perhaps we should start with our baseline conversation when we are funding, that the conversation should start at the baseline stage when we are setting out our indicators and targets. Apart from what we will report to the donor, we set out indicators and target at baseline on how we want to measure the social value of money for value. And lastly, I think also I listened to the conversation, so it's quite interesting, the point about value for money, doing it quarterly or not doing it quarterly. The conversations about value for money, the 3 is essentially focuses on input-output relationships and are not stretched to cover outcomes and impact. And so that is why we just keep on, okay, it's just about the input, output, efficiency, economy, and all those things. We focus on that. We don't look at outcomes and impact. And that is what one of the challenges with the current framework that we have. But I do believe that in the long run, we need to create alternatives to the dominant framework and to use those alternatives to challenge the dominant framework to be able to transform that to respond to our reality. Over. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thank you very much, Sadat. I can see that some hands are still up, but we have really gone past the time. What do we do? So we take them. I've seen one. All right, yeah. Yeah, okay, so we have one, we will take one hand up, which is Lawrence, but before Lawrence comes, please indicate in the chat box if you are interested in joining us and others to work on social value indicators, as we have talked about. If you are interested, please just drop it in the chat box and we will reach out to you to organize ourselves to work on this social value indicators. So we will take Lawrence now. Lawrence, we can hear you.
It's the second one. Yes, and play them. So this is so maybe you need some help.
I think we cannot get Lawrence to talk. And so thank you all very much for making the time to join this conversation, which is just one of the many others, because our practice is always evolving and it requires that from time to time we gather to exchange ideas and pick up ideas to enhance our practice. A lot of thoughts have been put across. We've tried to respond to them, and we have invited people to join us to fill a gap, which is, putting together indicators for measuring social value and using that to challenge the dominant culture or practice as we have it. And we do hope that we will get a lot of interest in working with us, so that those of us here who have access to international platforms, we would use that. Those of us who have access to other platforms, we would use it. But even more importantly, that they do inform how we do our practice wherever we find ourselves. And so we are bringing the webinar to an end now, and please, as you exit, complete the poll. It's up there now. We are seeing that people are already responding. On that note, thank you very much, and do have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
And good evening to our East African participants. Bye-bye.
So you can mute us. Then we wait for everybody.
Donors and civil society organizations alike are under increasing pressure to demonstrate value for money from the results of projects and programs. But what do we mean by value for money? Are we looking at resource and benefit justify the cost? Or we are talking about maximizing the impact of every cent, dollar, or cedi spent? Or we are looking at an evaluative judgment on whether resource use is justified? So, who matters? Whose perspective of value should matter most? Is it the donor who provided the funding or the NGOs delivering the projects? How about the people and communities who are to benefit? Are their voices being heard in these value judgments? What matters What should be measured is quantity and scale enough? That's how many communities and people, meetings and engagements held, or even policies produced tell the real story of impacts? How should it be assessed? How should it be measured when certain values cannot be easily measured, from community resilience to shocks, and empower citizens to social cohesion? When should it be assessed? If we know impacts manifest over a longer period of time, should we only be assessing value for money in the short to medium time scales of projects? As development practitioners, are we increasingly at risk of choosing approaches that produce quantifiable, unmeasurable results in order to demonstrate success more easily? Join the conversation. Be a part of this important discussion. You are welcome. Owners and civil society organizations alike are under increasing pressure to demonstrate value for money from the results of projects and programs. But what do we mean by value for money? Are we looking at resource and benefit justify the cost? The cost, or we are talking about maximizing the impact of every cent, dollar, or cedi spent, or we are looking at an evaluative judgment on whether resource use is justified. So, who matters? Whose perspective of value should matter most? Is it the donor who provided the funding, or the NGO delivering the project? How about the people and communities who are to benefit? Are their voices being heard in these value judgments? What matters? What should be measured is quantity and scale enough? That's how many communities and people, meetings and engagements held, or even policies produced tell the real story of impacts? How should it be assessed? How should it be measured when certain values cannot be easily measured, from community resilience to shocks, and empower citizens to social cohesion? When should it be assessed? If we know impacts manifest over a longer period of time, should we only be assessing value for money in the short to medium time scales of projects? As development practitioners, are we increasingly at risk of choosing approaches that produce quantifiable, owners and civil society organizations alike are under increasing pressure to demonstrate value for money from the results of projects and programs? But what do we mean by value for money? Are we looking at resource and benefit justify the cost? Or we are talking about maximizing the impact of every cent, dollar, or cedi spent? Or we are looking at an evaluative judgment on whether resource use is justified? So, who matters? Whose perspective of value should matter most? Is it the donor who provided the funding, or the NGO delivering the project? How about the people and communities who are to benefit? Are their voices being heard in these value judgments? What matters? What should be measured is quantity and scale enough? That's how many communities and people, meetings and engagements held, or even policies produced tell the real story of impacts? How should it be assessed? How should it be measured when certain values cannot be easily measured, from community resilience to shocks, and empower citizens to social cohesion? When should it be assessed? If we know impacts manifest over a longer period of time, should we only be assessing value for money in the short to medium time scales of projects? As development practitioners, are we increasingly at risk of choosing approaches that produce quantifiable owners and civil society organizations alike are under increasing pressure to demonstrate value for money from the results of projects and programs? But what do we mean by value for money? Are we looking at resource and benefit justify the cost? Or we are talking about maximizing the impact of every cent, dollar, or cedi spent? Or we are looking at an evaluative judgment on whether resource use is justified? So, who matters? Whose perspective of value should matter most? Is it the donor who provided the funding or the NGO delivering the project? How about the people and communities who are to benefit? Are their voices being heard in these value judgments? What matters? What should be measured? Is quantity and scale enough? That's how many communities and people, meetings and engagements held, or even policies produced tell the real story of impact? How should it be assessed? How should it be measured when certain values cannot be easily measured, from community resilience to short, and empower citizens to social cohesion? When should it be assessed? If we know impact manifests over a longer period of time, should we only be assessing value for money in the short to medium time scales of projects? As development practitioners, are we increasingly at risk of choosing approaches that produce quantifiable owners and civil society organizations alike are under increasing pressure to demonstrate value for money from the results of projects and programs? But what do we mean by value for money? Are we looking at resource and benefit justify the cost? Or we are talking about maximizing the impact of every cent, dollar, or cedi spent? Or we are looking at an evaluative judgment on whether resource use is justified? So, who matters? Whose perspective of value should matter most? Is it the donor who provided the funding or the NGO delivering the project? How about the people and communities who are to benefit? Are their voices being heard in these value judgments? What matters? What should be measured? Is quantity and scale enough? That's how many communities and people, meetings and engagements held, or even policies produced tell the real story of impact? How should it be assessed? How should it be measured when certain values cannot be easily measured, from community resilience to short, and empower citizens to social cohesion? When should it be assessed? If we know impact manifests over a longer period of time, should we only be assessing value for money in the short to medium time scales of projects? As development practitioners, are we increasingly at risk of choosing approaches that produce quantifiable owners and civil society organizations alike are under increasing pressure to demonstrate value for money from the results of projects and programs? But what do we